Jessica glanced at the clock. Its ticking the only sound in the quiet house. It was 10:47 p.m., a time she assumed Ethan, her 16-year-old son, would be deeply engrossed in his video games upstairs or fast asleep. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the framed family photo on the fireplace mantel. Her secret was locked in the confines of her phone, a lifeline to a double life she never intended to create. The dining table held the remnants of a hurried dinner, plates pushed aside to make room for her laptop and scattered papers. She told herself the chat had started innocently, a friend reconnecting after years. But tonight the conversation had escalated to something more. The words on the screen burned into her memory, a mix of confessions and temptation. And now, regret. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, as if to shield herself from the weight of what she had done. Her fingers hovered over her phone, contemplating deleting the messages. The logical part of her screamed for caution, but the emotional pull to revisit those fleeting moments of excitement kept her rooted. She typed another message, her heart racing as she hit send. The sound of a creaking floorboard startled her. Jessica spun around, her pulse quickening. Standing in the doorway was Ethan, dressed in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, his face pale with confusion and something darker. Betrayal. His gaze flicked from her flushed face to the phone clutched in her hand. "Mom!" His voice broke the silence, wavering between shock and disbelief. "What are you doing?" Jessica froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She quickly turned off the screen, tucking the phone behind her back. "Ethan!" she started, forcing a smile. "I thought you were asleep." "I couldn't sleep," he replied, stepping further into the room. "What's going on?" "It's nothing," Jessica said too quickly. The lie was fragile, and she knew Ethan could see through it. He always had a knack for reading her emotions, a trait that both comforted and unnerved her. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his voice firmer now. "It didn't look like nothing." Jessica felt the walls of her carefully constructed life closing in. She reached out a hand, but Ethan stepped back, his expression hardening. "You've been acting weird for weeks," he said, his tone sharp and accusing. "Is it something about Dad? Is everything okay?" The mention of Ethan's father, Mark, was like a slap to her conscience. She thought of the family dinners, the laughter they shared, and the promises she made to protect them both. Now, all of it felt fragile, dangling by a thread she had frayed. "It's complicated," Jessica admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan crossed his arms, his stance defiant. "Then explain it to me." Jessica hesitated, the weight of her son's trust pressing heavily on her chest. She glanced at the phone in her hand, then back at Ethan's face. The decision she made next would change their relationship forever. And for the first time in years, Jessica felt truly powerless. Ethan's piercing gaze felt like a searchlight, illuminating the secrets Jessica had desperately tried to keep hidden. Her mind raced, but no excuses came. The silence between them grew heavy. Each second an accusation. "You're not going to tell me, are you?" Ethan finally said, his voice tinged with both sadness and anger. He moved to the kitchen island, gripping its edge as though it would anchor him. "Do you think I'm stupid, that I don't notice things?" Jessica exhaled sharply. "Ethan, it's not about thinking you're stupid, it's complicated." "Stop saying that!" Ethan's voice cracked, a mixture of frustration and betrayal spilling out. "Everything's complicated when you don't want to explain it. Just tell me the truth." Jessica flinched, but forced herself to hold his gaze. I made a mistake, okay? A private one. It has nothing to do with you or your dad. It's my mess to handle." Ethan scoffed, his eyes brimming with tears he refused to shed. "Private? That's what you're calling it." His voice dropped, lower now but simmering with emotion. "I saw the look on your face, Mom. That wasn't nothing. You're hiding something, and it's wrong, isn't it?" The accusation stung, sharper than Jessica had anticipated. She reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away. The space between them felt like an uncrossable chasm. "Then, you have to understand." "Understand what?" he interrupted. "That you're not the person I thought you were? That the one person I always trusted is lying to my face?" Jessica felt her throat tighten. "It's not what you think." Ethan's laugh was bitter and devoid of humor. "You don't even know what I think, Mom. But you're scared. You're scared because you know whatever this is, it's bad enough that you can't say it out loud. Jessica's mind flashed to the messages she had sent earlier, the thrill of attention and validation that now curdled into shame. Her choices had consequences, ones that Ethan was now forced to confront alongside her. Trying to fix it, she said softly, her voice trembling. Fix it? Ethan said, incredulous. Fix what? Your guilt? Your lies? What about fixing us, Mom? Those words hung in the air like a final verdict. Jessica's heart sank as she realized the damage was already done. Ethan had seen through her facade, and the cost of her actions was now laid bare. Ethan stood his ground, his expression a storm of emotions, anger, confusion, and something deeper, harder to name. Jessica felt her composure slipping. She was the parent, the one supposed to be in control, but in this moment, she felt small and exposed. You don't understand how complicated adult relationships can be, Jessica tried again, though the words tasted hollow even to her. Ethan's face twisted into a grimace. Why does everyone always say that? You're just a kid. You wouldn't get it. But you know what, Mom? I do get it. I get that you've been sneaking around, hiding things, and now you don't have the guts to admit. Jessica wanted to protest, to tell him he didn't know the full story, but did she have the right? The truth she clung to felt slippery, coated in her own shame. She pressed her hands to her temples, as if physically trying to hold herself together. Ethan, she began, her voice shaking. I'm human. I've made mistakes. Big ones. But it doesn't change the fact that I love you, that I love our family. Ethan shook his head, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. If you love us, why would you do something to mess it all up? Why couldn't you just talk to Dad or someone instead of... He gestured vaguely, his voice breaking. Instead of this? Jessica froze, unsure how to respond. How could she explain the emptiness she had been trying to fill without making herself sound selfish? How could she justify something she barely understood herself? I didn't mean for you to get caught in the middle of this, she said finally. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Well, guess what? I am. You can't just keep it hidden now. I'm not going to pretend I didn't see anything. He glanced toward the staircase, where the silence of the house suddenly felt suffocating. What about Dad? Does he know? Or are you keeping this from him too? Jessica's heart plummeted. Mark, her husband, had no idea. His trust was intact, untouched, at least for now. Your father doesn't know, she admitted quietly, her words barely audible. Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment, the pain in them looked almost unbearable. You're not even going to tell him, are you? I'm trying to figure out the right way, Jessica said. I don't want to hurt him. Too late, Ethan snapped. You've already hurt me, Mom. And when Dad finds out, and he will find out, it's going to destroy him. Jessica's throat tightened as she watched her son turn away, heading for the stairs. Ethan, wait! She called after him. He stopped halfway up, his shoulders rigid. Without looking back, he said, You always tell me to be honest, to own up when I screw up. Maybe it's time you followed your own advice. With that, he disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, leaving Jessica alone with her guilt. The quiet was deafening. Jessica sank onto the couch, staring at her phone as though it held all the answers. Or maybe just a mirror to the chaos she had created. The weight of Ethan's words pressed down on her, suffocating and unrelenting. She realized with a sinking clarity that this was no longer about salvaging secrets. It was about salvaging her family. If that was even still possible. The house was eerily quiet after Ethan stormed upstairs. Jessica remained frozen on the couch, staring at the blank television screen as if its dark surface held the answers she couldn't find. The sound of her own breathing filled the room, shallow and uneven. She replayed Ethan's words in her head, each one slicing through her resolve like shards of glass. You've already hurt me, Mom. She clutched her phone tightly, the messages she had sent earlier feeling like a ticking bomb in her hand. A part of her wanted to erase them, to pretend they had never existed. But it was too late for that now. Ethan's discovery had pulled back the curtain on her carefully constructed facade. Jessica's thoughts shifted to Mark. For years he had been the steadfast foundation of their family, dependable, kind, and trusting. That trust now felt like a fragile vase she had dropped, shattered beyond repair. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the thought of confessing to him. How would he react? Could their marriage survive the truth? The sound of footsteps startled her. She looked up to see Ethan descending the stairs, his phone in hand and a determined look on his face. He stopped at the bottom step, staring at her as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he didn't want to touch. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone calmer but no less charged. "If you're not going to tell Dad, maybe I should." Jessica's heart lurched. "Ethan, no," she said quickly, standing up. "Why? Not?" he challenged, his voice rising again. "Why should I be the one carrying this? It's not fair, Mom. You put me in this position and now I have to sit here and pretend like nothing's wrong? That's not how this works." Jessica stepped closer, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "I know it's not fair. I know I've put you in an impossible situation, and I'm so sorry, Ethan. But please, let me handle this. I need to figure out how to fix it." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Fix it? How? By lying to him? By sweeping it under the rug and hoping he doesn't find out? He shook his head. "You don't get it, Mom. This isn't something you can just..." Jessica's shoulders slumped. She had always prided herself on being a good mother, someone Ethan could look up to. Now that image had crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. "I'm not asking you to lie," she said softly. "I just need time to make things right." Ethan hesitated, his expression flickering with doubt. Time for what? To come up with some excuse, or to keep pretending this never happened? "No," Jessica said firmly, "to be honest. To own up to what I've done." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed as if Ethan might relent. But then his phone buzzed, breaking the tension. He glanced down, his brow furrowing as he read the notification. "What is it?" Jessica asked, her stomach tightening with dread. Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable. "It's Dad. He wants to know why I'm acting weird." Jessica's heart sank. Of course, Mark had noticed something was off. Ethan had always been close to his father, and their bond was built on an unspoken trust. That trust would now be tested in ways Jessica couldn't bear to imagine. "Are you going to tell him?" Jessica asked carefully. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't keep lying, not to him." Jessica took a step forward, her voice pleading. "Ethan, please, just give me one day to talk to your dad and explain everything. I promise I'll tell him the truth." Ethan stared at her, his expression conflicted. "You're really going to tell him?" "Yes," Jessica said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "I'll tell him everything. But I need to do it in my own way, on my own terms." Ethan studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "You've got one day," he said. "But if you don't tell him by tomorrow night, I will." Jessica exhaled in relief, though the reprieve felt fragile and fleeting. "Thank you," she said. Without another word, Ethan turned and went back upstairs, leaving Jessica alone once more. She sank back onto the couch, her mind racing. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second a reminder that time was running out. Jessica thought of the vows she and Mark had exchanged years ago, the promises to love and cherish each other through all of life's trials. She had broken those vows, but perhaps there was still a chance to rebuild what she had shattered. Taking a deep breath, she opened her phone and began typing a message, not to the person who had been the source of her transgressions, but to Mark. "Can we talk? It's important." She hit send, her hands trembling. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The next evening arrived faster than Jessica anticipated. The day had been a blur, every hour punctuated by the weight of her pending confession. She replayed her conversation with Ethan over and over, his words echoing in her mind. By the time Mark walked through the door, his usual warmth and casual demeanor felt like a cruel juxtaposition to the storm brewing within her. "Hey," Mark said, setting his briefcase down and shrugging off his coat. "Everything okay?" Ethan seemed a little off this morning. Jessica managed a weak smile, her heart pounding. "We need to talk. she said, her voice strained. Mark froze, his brow furrowing as he studied her. Okay, he said cautiously. What's going on? Jessica gestured to the couch, waiting until they were both seated before speaking. She clasped her hands tightly, trying to steady them. There's something I need to tell you, she began, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Mark's concern deepened. Jessica, you're scaring me. What's wrong? She took a deep breath, her chest tightening as the words she dreaded tumbled out. I've been talking to someone I shouldn't have. It started as a friendship, but it became something more. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's expression shifted from confusion to shock, his eyes widening as the weight of her confession sank in. What do you mean, something more? He asked, his voice low and measured. Jessica felt a lump rise in her throat. Messages, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Flirting mostly, but it crossed a line. Mark leaned back, his face unreadable. How long has this been going on? Jessica hesitated. A few months, she said. Mark stood abruptly, pacing the room. Why? He asked, his tone a mix of anger and disbelief. Why would you do this? We've built a life together, Jessica. We've raised a son. And now? This? Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. I wasn't thinking, she said. I was lonely, and it was a mistake. I know I hurt you, both of you, and I'll do anything to fix it. Mark stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hard. You hurt Ethan too? Jessica nodded. He found out last night. Mark sank into the armchair, running a hand through his hair. So, what now? He asked quietly. Jessica moved closer, her voice trembling. I want to make things right, Mark. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Mark looked at her for a long time, his eyes heavy with hurt. Finally, he sighed. I don't know if we can fix this, Jessica. But for Ethan's sake, we have to try. Jessica felt a flicker of hope. Thank you, she whispered. Mark didn't reply. Instead, he got up and walked to the kitchen, leaving Jessica alone with her guilt and the faintest glimmer of a second chance.